On a freezing February Tuesday, Giselle Harmon signed that contract, unable to hide her arrogant smirk. $1,000, that was her price. For a neglected garage she dismissed as worthless junk too expensive to even demolish. Caleb stood directly across from her, wearing his worn work jacket. His hands bore the engine grease that no amount of scrubbing could ever wash away. He did not argue or flinch for a second. Caleb simply took the keys, nodded, and walked out into the biting winter cold. Giselle whispered to her assistant, sending a wave of mockery through her corporate team. Yet 6 months later, Caleb Merritt's name would headline the regional business journal, while Giselle Harmon, the arrogant CEO who signed that deal, stood outside the thriving property she had so eagerly cast aside, staring at a growing business empire she could no longer reclaim. Today, you and I will explore how this forgotten garage redefined the meaning of value, and where it truly hides, and the steep price of blind arrogance when ignoring the massive potential standing right in front of you. Caleb grew up in a home filled with the sharp scent of stale coffee and motor oil. His father, Raymond Merritt, opened a modest Detroit workshop in 1987, laboring for 22 years until his body gave out and his hands could no longer hold a wrench. Caleb spent nearly every single Saturday of his childhood inside those walls, not wasting time with television but learning a trade. He learned to read an engine's roar the way a doctor reads a pulse. He studied stress fractures on a metal chassis like a master engineer analyzing blueprints. He looked past the heavy rust and dead batteries to find the pure mechanical soul underneath. By age 17, he could pinpoint a misfiring engine simply by hearing it idle. At 19, he rebuilt complex transmissions entirely from scratch. At 22, he earned his degree in automotive systems engineering from the State University. Graduating near the top of his class, he secured a position at Vantage Auto Holdings, a prominent firm highly respected for its elite vehicle restoration division. The role demanded intense academic knowledge blended with pure raw mechanic instinct. Armed with both, he spent 7 dedicated years grinding away at the company. Never the loudest voice in the room, he was always the most precise. His fellow mechanics trusted him, while management relied deeply on his technical reports. Caleb became the specialist they called when a project seemed absolutely impossible to rescue. Yet, cold corporations rarely reward the hard-working visionaries they rely on to survive. 8 months before the collapse, Vantage Auto Holdings finalized a major corporate merger. The fresh executives had zero interest in supporting their restoration department. It failed to fit their rigid financial models or generate instant corporate profits. The division simply did not look appealing on a corporate slide deck. 14 skilled craftsmen lost their livelihoods that Friday evening. The layoffs were sent via email at precisely 11:17 in the evening. Caleb read his in a small, cramped apartment that barely had room for his tools, let alone his young daughter's bed. He did not reply. He simply locked his phone, sat in the total dark, and eventually forced himself to sleep. The very next morning, he sat down to map his future. He spent 8 grueling months scraping by, repairing salvaged wrecks at the local vehicle impound lot. We all know that hard grind, saving every penny while preparing to build something from nothing. Owen refused to waste his energy on useless bitterness or noise. He hunted for real opportunity, just like his father taught him with broken engines. Quietly, methodically, knowing a real breakthrough never just announces itself. At 31, this single dad had zero debt and $18,000 saved. Not enough to buy a fancy shop, but enough to build a future for his kid. Meanwhile, Giselle Harmon had never fixed a single thing with her own hands. And she would have told you exactly that, without apologizing once. Her brain worked differently. She was fiercely financial, territorial, and entirely ruthless. At 38, she controlled Harmon Capital Group, an investment firm her dad handed her at 29, which she aggressively expanded over the next decade. Company revenue had easily more than doubled. They pivoted from flipping houses straight into massive commercial development. Then into urban industrial projects, buying up dead manufacturing land dirt cheap, getting it rezoned and selling to big commercial builders for massive profits. Her entire empire relied on spotting land value before anyone else did. That is why the irony of their entire situation felt so sharp. Giselle had a fierce reputation for being blunt to the point of cruelty. She would kill a meeting the second she felt it wasted her time. And she treated anything she did not instantly understand as completely beneath her notice. She was praised as a brilliant visionary by her peers. The local chamber loved her, while rivals she negotiated against called her a bulldozer. Both of those descriptions were actually pretty dead on. She wasn't exactly mean just for the fun of being a bully. She was purely indifferent, which is entirely different, and honestly a lot harder to fight. Indifference does not care about facts the way that pure anger sometimes does. It simply ignores the hard evidence before it even hits the table. That January, her firm bought a 4-acre plot of beat-up industrial land on the northeast edge of town. An old manufacturing zone that had been sitting totally dead for over 10 years. Her game plan was simple. Sit on the property and force a rezoning permit for mixed commercial real estate. Then flip the whole parcel to a massive corporate developer within 2 years. On paper, her new acquisition was spotless. In reality, it came with a headache. Tucked in the back corner of that property was an abandoned garage structure. Barely 900 square feet, built back in the 1960s with a rusted tin roof. Smashed interior shelves everywhere, and a heavy roll-up door that had not moved in 3 years. And the wiring, one of her corporate techs described it in a single word: dead. Giselle's people ran the demolition numbers. They figured clearing it out cost between $12,000 and $15,000. She had zero interest in wasting cash on a total dump she viewed as a liability. When the idea of just selling the shack came up, they had a brief internal chat. She signed off on it faster than you could pour a cup of hot coffee. List the property, get rid of it, just move on. Owen was the one who heard about the garage from a local truck driver hauling scrap. He and his buddy Caleb Advantage had worked side by side for 3 years, staying tight even after the layoffs. Now Owen freelanced, doing welding, metal fabrication, and occasional engine work. My friend called that night with a rumor, chasing a gut instinct instead of hard facts. He laid out everything he knew. An abandoned, ruined garage. Harmon Capital wanted it gone cheap. I listened quietly, already seeing the potential. At sunrise, I parked my old truck across the street to study the place. It was barely 20 degrees, with freezing snow whipping sideways in the wind. I sat in the cab studying that abandoned wreck for 15 quiet minutes. To most people, it was just junk. The main door was completely warped. Half of the small side windows were completely boarded over. The entire roof slumped heavily on the far corner. But empire builders look far beneath the ugly surface. I was calculating the square footage, studying that solid concrete foundation, evaluating how it sat on the lot, but more importantly, analyzing the strategic address. I knew this exact intersection, having driven past it dozens of times. I knew the surrounding neighborhood and exactly what sat right next door. And I had a powerful feeling about the major real estate development hitting this forgotten side of town within 18 months. I dialed the phone number listed right there on the rusted gate. I reached an assistant at Harmon Capital and requested a private property tour. We locked in an appointment for the following week. The CEO, Giselle, arrived with her assistant, a structural engineer, and an expensive real estate attorney. She wore a designer wool coat and expensive heeled boots. She carried the smug look of someone who assumed this meeting was a waste of time. I showed up alone. Wearing my faded work jacket and holding a simple notebook, I arrived 2 minutes early. As Giselle's luxury sedan pulled up, she stepped out. She glanced around the dilapidated lot. She judged me in 3 seconds, completely blind to the ambition driving my vision. Smirking at her assistant, she asked if I was just a local mechanic or scrap collector. I did not even bother answering her insult. I simply asked to see the inside. Unlocking the side door, she waved me inside, and her corporate entourage followed close behind. She began pointing out every single flaw, like an agent selling the property in reverse. The massive metal door had been jammed shut for 3 years. 3 large structural cracks split the old wooden ceiling beams. The electrical wiring was completely dead. Their inspection warned of severe foundation settling in the northwest corner. Factoring in demolition, she valued the entire property at negative $15,000. She spoke loudly, without a single shred of pity. She was blind to the true value, thinking she was just offloading trash. She thought she was dumping a headache, completely unaware she was hand-delivering an empire. I nodded quietly, stepping deeper into the dark interior. It was pitch black inside. I switched on my flashlight. I moved slowly from wall to wall, running my hand along the cold, sturdy concrete. I swept the light across the ceiling, crouching down to inspect the solid floors. After 12 quiet minutes inside, I stepped back into the freezing wind with one question. How much? Giselle stared at him with pure amusement. She sneered at her corporate crew, repeating the measly price so they could all laugh. To them, his desperate struggle was a joke, $1,000. She pushed over a ruthless contract demanding full liability waivers and strict relocation terms, forcing him to vacate in 18 months when their massive redevelopment project finally broke ground on this worthless dirt. He agreed without hesitating. He signed the paperwork on a cheap folding table abandoned near the gate. Cold wind swept the dirt lot while their slick attorney hovered over him. Deals done, keys pocketed, he heard Giselle whisper a final insult to her partner, mocking him for buying a ruined garage, just another foolish dad chasing a dead dream. They snickered in their expensive suits, walking back to their luxury cars. But this dad stood firm at the rusted gate. He paced the rotting exterior one last time, already visualizing what he could build here. He stopped near the side door for just a moment, peering through a warped frame gap at a massive shape in the shadows. A colossal mound hidden under dusty blue tarps rising high above the greasy floor. He kept quiet, climbed into his old truck and drove away. He returned at dawn, ready to uncover the truth. Armed with a heavy flashlight, a steel pry bar, and a simple notebook. Ignoring the crumbling walls, he went straight for the mysterious tarps. 8 massive canvas mounds stood waiting in the darkness. You and I know that treasures are always buried deep under decades of heavy grime. He slowly peeled the very first canvas back. His hands shook, desperately needing a miracle for his daughter, terrified of losing everything. Beneath lay a classic car. He ripped the second tarp, another machine. He uncovered all 8 in under 30 minutes. Each reveal was a shockwave, 8 vintage masterpieces parked in perfect rows, left to rot inside the very building those corporate elites had deemed worthless. They only saw a demolition target, looking but never actually seeing. They never peeked under the tarps, and we know exactly what they missed. He stood frozen among these hidden treasures, his flashlight drifting slowly across the flawless chrome, left completely speechless. Wiping the heavy dust, he read the emblem, a 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback. The classic body showed minor surface rust on the panels. The paint peeled in ugly strips, but the original chrome remained immaculate. The glass was perfect. When he pried open the heavy door, the odometer proved this beauty had sat untouched for decades. He rubbed the VIN plate, fully original stampings. Under the hood lay a massive V8 engine, completely intact with no fatal damage. He noted the valuable numbers in his notebook, closing the hood gently. Unveiling the second treasure stole his breath even faster than the first. A '69 Camaro Z28, an incredibly rare production model that serious collectors would pay a fortune for. They would drop massive cash even for wrecked, empty shells. Its frame was crisp, proving that empires are truly built on what others abandon. He wrote that number down and slowly circled it, seeing the potential. The next 3 vehicles were neglected sedans from the 50s and early 60s. A 58 Bel Air, a 61 Galaxy, and 63 Riviera, all salvageable treasures. Every single one meant decent cash after restoration, just not empire-building money. But that 6th vehicle stopped him cold. He had to crouch down, squinting at the dusty badge to make absolutely sure his tired eyes weren't playing tricks on him. A rare 1971 Tomaso Pantera, a legendary Italian-American sports car born from a unique short-lived partnership between an Italian designer and Ford's engine division, leaving a tiny global total. A total production run hitting maybe 10,000 units ever. Finding one in any condition was absolutely unbelievable. But finding one hidden in an abandoned northeast garage with a solid chassis and intact mid-engine compartment, that is the stuff of legends. Except this was not a Hollywood redemption story just yet. It was still just a freezing hollow building pierced by a single flashlight beam. And there he was, a tired single father in a dusty jacket, scribbling numbers with a shaking hand. The final two vehicles were far too gone to save. Their floors had collapsed, but they still held valuable parts others would overlook. And parts meant survival cash. He logged everything, calculating his rough gut estimate. Sitting on a cracked crate in that freezing garage, clutching his worn notebook, he stared at a potential value between $400,000 and $600,000, if he put in the sweat equity. And he had paid exactly $1,000 for this supposedly worthless junk pile. Let us watch as he walked those quiet surrounding blocks that afternoon. He knew these streets, not from maps, but the way a blue-collar worker knows the grit of his neighborhood. His new garage sat right on a corner lot where two major side roads intersected, exactly a quarter of a mile from a busy federal highway on-ramp, and sitting right next to a transit bus corridor which the City Transit Authority had been secretly planning to expand for 18 long months. 3 completely empty lots sat directly behind his garage, facing that secondary road. They were listed dirt cheap, fully reflecting their miserable, trash-filled state. They were abandoned, overgrown, and trapped behind rusted wire. But here is the secret: nobody else connected those dots on the map yet. He had an old friend from his engineering years named Marcus, now working in city planning. He called him that evening. He asked a simple, casual question about the future development zones for that specific neighborhood. Marcus gave a very simple, dead serious answer. The entire block sat inside what hidden city documents called a Phase 2 commercial priority zone, meaning within 12 to 18 months those massive upgrades would be officially announced, and land values in that zone would absolutely skyrocket. He thanked his friend, hung up, and sat at his small kitchen table. He stared at the scrawled numbers in his notebook, and finally smiled. It was the first time he truly smiled since the devastating night of his layoff. He called his close friend Owen the next morning, keeping the details quiet. He only shared that he found a massive opportunity, even without an immediate salary. He firmly believed that building this empire from nothing would be worth the grind. Owen asked the price. You and I know the punchline, only $1,000. Silence on the line. Owen asked me to repeat the address. I did, unwavering. More dead air. Finally, Owen said he would meet me there by 8. Owen stepped into that freezing garage, saw those 8 dust-covered classics, and froze dead in his tracks. He stared at the Camaro, the Mustang, and the Pantera, seeing only ruins. He turned to me and whispered that he needed to sit down. I told him we start with the Mustang. He dropped his coat, ready to build this empire. Those first 2 months were brutal, the kind of grinding, dirty work that weeds out the quitters. It was freezing, endless, and honestly, completely soul-crushing. I slept right on the shop floor those first 3 weeks to save every penny. I set up a cheap cot by the south wall to block the biting wind. We turned wrenches from pitch-black morning to pitch-black night. That Mustang needed a complete crankshaft replacement, a heavy piece we had to hunt down from a private supplier in Ohio. While waiting 3 weeks, we pivoted our hustle to prep the Camaro and the Bel Air. Tearing engines down, scrubbing grease, deciding what to salvage and what to scrap entirely. I watched every single penny I invested. $18,000 felt like enough runway, but with rare replacement parts. Specialty fluids, body compounds, and completely fresh wiring. Plus all the sheet metal Owen burned daily, my bank balance was locked in a rapid nosedive. 1 month in, I was down to $1,200. I kept my mouth shut. I took some night shifts driving a tow truck, working the impound lot just to float our next order, never breathing a word to Owen. Mid-February, a brutal rainstorm hit, and a section of our eastern roof gave way. Not a total collapse, but freezing water poured right into the Camaro's open engine bay. The very motor we had just stripped down. Owen slammed his fist on the bench, letting out a string of unrepeatable curses. I just stood there, watching muddy water flood our exposed cylinders. Then I threw 2 heavy tarps over the vulnerable parts to protect our dream. I soaked up the mess with shop rags, kept my head down, and pushed forward anyway. Owen stared at me for a solid minute, then grabbed his wrench and joined me in the cold. There was a brutal stretch around In the 3rd week of February, I sat alone in that freezing shop at midnight, clutching a tiny, worn-out notebook. Not the cheap spiral notebook tracking our vehicle specs. It was an old, water-stained journal that belonged to my old man. My father filled those pages over 30 years of working on broken-down engines. Quick observations, precise measurements, crucial reminders. Hard-earned pieces of blue-collar wisdom, built slowly like grease in a rusty bolt's threads. Right near the middle, etched in his heavy, blunt handwriting, lay a simple truth: when they see rust, you see the metal underneath. I had read those exact words 100 times growing up. As a kid, it just sounded like a clever mechanic's proverb. But as a struggling father, you and I know that seeing opportunity in what others abandon is how you build an empire. I grabbed a pen, took a breath, and scrawled right underneath, $1,000 February. This is where our empire starts. I snapped the journal shut, tucked it deep inside my jacket, and kept it close until this garage empire was fully built. By late March, we had finally finished rebuilding that abandoned Mustang. No flashy candy paint, no cheap aftermarket parts slapped on. Restored entirely to original factory specifications, just like true collectors demand. We stripped those battered body panels down, primed them, and sprayed the factory shade of Highland green. We re-chromed the rough metal and preserved the original trim wherever possible. The matching numbers engine was rebuilt with period-correct vintage parts. Carburetor rebuilt, cooling system completely sealed, and the old interior wrapped in factory-correct black vinyl. When my boy Owen rolled it out that Saturday morning, the sun peeked over our rusted roof. He sat behind the wheel and gave the key a turn. That heavy motor caught right away. It cranked, then settled into a deep, steady rumble, commanding total respect. I just stood there at the edge of our once-abandoned garage door. We rebuilt this broken garage back in January. Now, with my arms crossed, I listened to that idle for a full minute. Owen revved the engine once, gently. That exhaust note ripped through the crisp air, saying something pure that you simply cannot measure with dollar signs. I told my son it was good, then quietly walked back inside. You and I know quality speaks. I posted one listing on a private forum for serious classic car collectors. No loud auction blocks, no public sites, just a carefully honest, detailed description. Clean vehicle history, clear photos of our sweaty restoration work, and my phone number. I got 11 serious inquiries in just 72 hours. The single message I put first came from a woman named Diana Ashford. 55 years old, she was a quiet widow who inherited a massive estate from her late husband, a man who built his massive fortune in heavy industrial manufacturing. He spent 10 years building one of the most respected private collections of vintage classic cars in the Northeast, stored safely in a climate-controlled facility on her private Vermont estate. She did not try pushing me around. Instead, she asked sharp questions about the VIN tags and original build sheets. She asked which exact suppliers we used for the chrome dipping. She wanted the engine rebuild paperwork. I answered every single question with the exact same blue-collar precision she brought to me. She booked a flight to inspect the car herself, bringing along her personal mechanical engineer, a grumpy retired Chrysler veteran named George. He wore a flat cap, kept his mouth shut, and spent 2 solid hours under my car, just poking around the engine bay with a tiny camera and thick notebook. George finally muttered to Diana that our humble garage restoration was, in his professional opinion, the most factory-correct restoration he had ever seen outside a $1 million museum. Diana shook my hand, offering $94,000. I agreed. That wire transfer hit my bank 3 days later. My boy saw the bank alert on my cracked phone screen and squeezed my shoulder hard. I allowed it for 2 seconds, stepped back, and gave him a single nod. Then I walked straight back to my messy workbench, grinding down the next abandoned Camaro's parts. Right before she left our dusty lot, Diana said something. Something you and I know changes a man's life forever. Pulling on her leather driving gloves next to her car, she looked right at me. She mentioned wealthy collectors in her circle, desperately hunting for honest, top-tier classic auto restoration. She said, "If you rebuild anything else worthy, call me before you show the world." I told her I appreciated it, and I truly did. But she had no clue about the 6 hidden cars waiting right behind her. We saw what she missed. She would have fought to keep at least 2 of them. 2 weeks after that Mustang deal, Diana shared my contact with 2 wealthy collectors in her elite circle, and both called immediately. Before the month even ended, our restored 1958 Bel Air was sold. Stunning Snowcrest White over India Ivory, sold for $28,500. From just those two sales. Think about it. We turned a small $19,000 investment into $122,500. I instantly made a move on the surrounding land. I tracked down the owners of those two abandoned lots right behind my workshop. No real estate agents, no public listings, just pure negotiation. I snatched up both properties in a private deal for $67,000. The owners had no idea about the upcoming commercial zoning changes, so they gladly accepted my quick cash. I handled the deeds myself and began structuring the new business. I even secured a third lot with a purchase option set for 60 days. I hired 2 skilled mechanics, including a true bodywork expert named Kevin. He had spent several years refining his craft at a top-tier Pennsylvania shop. I also recruited a legendary parts locator named Ray. Ray had spent 15 years tracking down rare automotive pieces through underground networks. My trusted partner Owen stepped up as the technical director of our expanding business. We officially registered our growing empire as Merritt Restoration and Auto Works. That rusted to Tomaso Pantera took 6 brutal weeks, pushing my team to their absolute limits. Its core was a powerful Ford Cleveland V8 mounted midship inside that Italian frame. Years of neglect had seized the engine completely. Saving the engine block required a careful chemical soak that took 11 long days. It took a level of patient focus that Owen called borderline spiritual. Tracking down authentic body panels meant importing custom metalwork. We sourced them from an old Italian craftsman who only communicated using a dusty vintage fax machine. Restoring the interior required hunting down original factory-spec vinyl and carpet from separate suppliers. One based in Germany, the other located in New Jersey. My team literally had to rebuild every wheel from the center hub outward. The messy wiring harnesses were, according to Owen's colorful assessment, a total nightmare designed by Italian engineers to test the sanity of guys like us. But when we rolled it under the bright shop lights, the transformation was unbelievable. The deep blood-red paint was so incredibly rich it seemed to swallow the light around it. A sharp, aggressive profile. It looked as strikingly bold as when it left the factory in 1971. It was easily the most impressive machine our team had ever rescued from the scrap heap. Around that time, a journalist named Charlotte Webb was covering local stories for the Business Review, and she possessed a real talent for uncovering the exact kind of overlooked underdog stories that you and I love. Word of our growing workshop reached her through a wealthy collector at local auto shows. She reached out in early June, but I politely told her I preferred staying quiet. Undeterred, she sent me a direct email the very next morning. You see, that reporter never promised him easy PR or glowing praise. Her email bluntly stated she had no interest in documenting easy success. She wanted the exact moment he saw opportunity where others saw nothing. That spark when everyone else saw trash, but he saw an empire. He read her email twice, slept on it, and finally granted her 30 minutes. They met at the garage, which was now a humming, fully functional auto shop. A thriving business looking nothing like the frozen, abandoned dump he first unlocked. They talked for over 2 hours as Charlotte asked about the classic cars and tarps. She dug into that freezing February morning, the rusty key, and the deal. She wanted to know who abandoned this gold mine to him. He answered her directly with absolutely no anger. Harmon Capital Group sold it to him, and their wealthy CEO signed it himself. Charlotte quickly scribbled that down, aggressively underlining his name. The massive Barrett-Jackson special auto consignment arrived on the final weekend. Saturday of June, hosted at a massive downtown conference center. He submitted the Pantera back in January, long before the restoration was complete. Thanks to the classic car's rare history and his precise rebuild blueprint, it made the cut as one of 10 featured lots for the auction. He showed up wearing a dark suit, his first since burying his father 5 years ago. His boy Owen sat in the second row, arms folded tight. His jaw was locked in that tough little look he always used when trying to hide how nervous he was. Diana Ashford watched from the crowd. She had heard of his rebuild and brought 2 sassive buyers from her collector circle. They locked eyes from across the room. Across that crowded reception hall, she gave him a slow nod of real respect. His masterfully restored Pantera was the 8th car up. when it rolled through the curtains and hit the glare of the overhead lights. Let's look closely. You could actually hear the silence. No clapping yet. Just a massive shared gasp when true automotive perfection enters the room. The auctioneer hyped the machine, praising its rare history and their grueling restoration work. And when he announced his name, crediting Merritt Auto Works for this absolute magic, a massive portion of the crowd who had read Charlotte's Underdog story, which had launched online just 4 days ago, began clapping loudly, a reaction far warmer than the usual polite auction golf claps. Bidding kicked off at $80,000. It shot straight to $100,000, hit $130,000, paused at $155,000 before a phone bid hit $168,000. A buyer in row 3 countered at $172,000. The phone bidder struck back. The room fell dead silent. You and I both know that tension when the stakes get this high. Sold for $178,000. His son let out a sigh of relief so loud the neighbor stared. He sat completely frozen as the gavel fell, before finally standing up to shake the floor representative's hand. He remained perfectly calm, the way someone only does when they have built an empire from an abandoned garage, grinding for the exact moment it all pays off. Not shocked, not overwhelmed, just proven absolutely right. I caught Giselle Harmon staring in the crowd. She wasn't there for classic cars. She only showed up because her attorney demanded it. Right after that local newspaper piece hit, he warned her to see our entire operation firsthand before planning her next public relations move. She lingered near the back of the auction room, just staring. She watched the bids skyrocket and she watched the gavel slam down. She watched me accept the handshakes and congratulations with a quiet, simple nod. Once the bidding ended and the room cleared out, she marched right over to me. That long walk forced her to swallow her massive pride. Not real regret, since corporate bosses are missing that gear, but something awfully close. She had to completely silence that arrogant voice in her head that was spinning a defensive corporate lie, since the morning her assistant slammed that article down. A local reporter saw her making a beeline for me and whipped her notebook out. Giselle finally stopped right in front of me. No entourage today. No assistant, no high-priced lawyer, no structural engineer, just her. Wearing a different designer coat than she wore back in freezing February. Looking up at a single dad whose rising empire just hit major business magazines. A blue-collar mechanic who just sold a restored classic for over $178,000. She quietly admitted she had completely misjudged my business. She kept it brief and she did not offer any excuses. Coming from a regular decent person, those few words might feel cheap, but from a wealthy executive who built a billionaire empire acting like her instincts were sharper than anyone else on earth, that tiny admission felt like a massive victory. I just looked at her. I didn't drag us back to that awful day in February. I refused to throw her cruel, nasty insults back in her face. I didn't rub her nose in the massive success story I had pulled off. I simply told her dead calm. She looked at an abandoned property and wrote it off based purely on the surface, while I saw opportunity and bet everything on the solid foundation hidden deep in the dirt. I explained we simply measured the exact same salvage yard using entirely different scales. Then I held out my calloused hand, and she shook it. I turned around, walked over to my son Owen, whispered how proud I was, and we both stared at the empty spot where our masterpiece had rested. And then we excitedly started planning our next custom Camaro build. Stick with me here. By late June, the actual financial reality of our growing business empire looked incredible. Our total income from classic car sales at the auctions cleared $398,000. Those 3 abandoned lots I snatched up right behind the original rusty garage had. Right after the city finally announced their massive new transit project in May, shot up to an appraised value of $520,000. That is roughly triple what I scraped together to buy them. Our active auto repair contracts included a major job for Diana Ashford, restoring a classic car she wanted us to resurrect, plus 2 more wealthy clients from her circle, locking in $145,000. Tallying up our true total worth, including the property and heavy shop tools, plus those pending jobs and the 2 abandoned classics we are actively rebuilding. Our business valuation easily crossed $1 million. I offered Owen Parker 20% equity in this growing empire. He signed immediately. He saw the same vision I did. I finally filed the building permit to construct our permanent shop on this unified lot. A multi-bay auto shop complete with a professional paint booth, a climate-controlled storage garage, and a sleek new office wing. On the official blueprints, I named it Merritt Auto Works Building 1. One Thursday night in July, after my crew left, I drove back alone, not to work but just to stand inside the empire we built from nothing. We completely replaced that ruined, leaking roof in April. We scrubbed, patched, and sealed the old concrete floor ourselves. The garage door hummed on a new motor. Every electrical wire was completely brand new. The shop was clean, bright, and thriving. For the first time, our creation felt genuinely alive. I quietly walked over to the eastern corner, the exact spot where I laid my hand against the cold wall on that very first morning. Surrounded then by ripped tarps, my dim flashlight, and a cheap notebook, that single piece of wall remained completely untouched. Stained by old roof rust and darkened by years of neglect, the original concrete block looked exactly as it did when I first touched it. During the long rebuild, I gave Kevin strict orders to leave that one section alone. Kevin looked confused, asking me why. I just told him it was the most important part of our empire, and it had to stay exactly as it was. I stood there staring at it, my mind completely quiet and at peace, just soaking in the exact spot where our massive comeback began. Then I turned off the shop lights, locked the heavy doors, and walked to my truck. People eventually heard our story, and a whole lot of them did. Since Charlotte Webb's article hit 3 major magazines, they constantly asked me what the secret to my success was. I gave them different answers, depending on the day. It depended entirely on who was asking and what they needed to hear. To fellow blue-collar workers, I said fancy degrees and corporate loyalty will never save you. You have to build your own empire with your own 2 hands. I told the younger guys that being dismissed by others doesn't make you wrong. I kept my mouth shut around reporters, learning that the more words I gave them, the more their own assumptions would fill the silence I left behind. And I preferred our journey to stand for the honest, hard truth rather than some flashy headline designed for quick clicks. But the shortest answer I ever gave, the one they printed most, revealed the ultimate truth of building an empire. Look closer at what others abandoned before you decide. Yet privately, inside the worn notebook sitting in my jacket pocket, I penned a deeper truth right below my father's notes and my own dark thoughts from February. I wrote that Giselle looked at the immediate cost and called it value, and that I just looked for the true value, letting the costs settle themselves. She looked at a rusted, abandoned ruin and saw a hopeless failure, while I looked at that exact same rusted metal and saw the foundation of a future empire. I wrote that neither of us was actually being irrational. We had just been trained to search for entirely different things. In that quiet transaction on that freezing morning, I looked where others stopped. You see, most people only saw $1,000 transaction, but for a father looking to build a future, it meant a whole new life. He snapped his worn notebook shut. Outside his tiny new office, framed by hand in the corner of that neglected garage, the bright lights of Merritt Auto Works were finally shining into the night. In the back bay, a lone air compressor hummed softly right through the thin drywall. He sat there listening to its steady mechanical heartbeat. It was the sweet sound of a thriving empire finally coming alive. A dream built from one desperate choice in the freezing cold, clutching a rusty key. In his pocket, a scribbled phone number and a fiercely stubborn way of seeing pure gold in the rusted-out junk that wealthy people simply ignored. That de Tomaso Pantera sold for $178,000. It sat for 40 years under a tarp in a space valued at -$15,000. A wealthy executive sold him that property for $1,000, laughing because she only saw trash. But he paid the cash. $1,000, because he saw opportunity where she stopped looking, and in the end, what he truly understood wasn't just rare cars or the dirt they sat on. It wasn't the fancy contracts, the big auctions, or the high-profile handshakes. It was recognizing the massive gap between what something looks like and what it can become. Bridging that gap took 6 brutal months of sweat, waking up before dawn and grinding past midnight for his family. And it proved to be worth far more than $1,000. It turned out to be worth absolutely everything.